morning. Welcome to Far Australia's Victorian Crop Technology Centre. It was about 3 years ago that we started filming in here for the first year of hyper yielding crops, and now we're back again in that very same paddock. Not quite as wet as 2022, a huge build-up of disease, and of course in the high rainfall zone here just outside of Geelong in southern Victoria, our main disease is Septoria triticide blotch, and we're looking at that disease to look at the effects of last year's high inoculum loads and looking at how that relates to the kind of disease pressure that we've got this year. And this is actually part of our hyper yielding crops project, and we're looking at disease management, trying to identify the varieties we can use far less fungicides in. And when we were here 3 years ago, our primary issues again were Septoria, but also stripe rust. Again this year, 4 varieties, and I'm going to start you with one that we are seeing Septoria in, and this is Stockade. It's an improvement over Trojan, slower maturity, not the stripe rust susceptibility, but we can see, looking into the canopy, that we still have issues with Septoria triticide blotch following the 22 season when there was an abundance of this disease in this region. Moving along from the longer season spring wheat Stockade, and we're here in early September, crops starting to stem elongate. Some have had their first sprays. In fact, the majority have had their first fungicide sprays. Then moving along to what we hope will take the pressure off our fungicides. More resistant winter wheats. And here we've got 0005 from AGT. And when you look at those base leaves, they don't have that triticide in this untreated crop compared to the Stockade. And it's actually the same with another line, the AGF 4818, which we've had since 2020. The Septoria resistance that these wheats have has been exceptional. So what's different about the spring of 2023? Well, as many of you will be experiencing, our rainfall, particularly through August, has been below average. In fact, I think across Australia, we're running at just less than 50% of the average rainfall for that month. Here in the high rainfall zone, perhaps we should be thinking closely about the effects of lower rainfall, because here, just outside of Geelong, like I say, we're looking at rainfall that's about 37% of what we normally get for August. And that's important because actually, although we don't always want it, dry weather brings with it probably one of our better fungicides. Because if we think about Septoria triticide, stubble-borne disease, encouraged by very wet weather, particularly during this stem elongation period, when the key leaves that we need to protect, which we refer to as the money leaves, are emerging. And what's happening is, though we can find Septoria in the base of the more susceptible varieties, one of the things we're noting is that the disease seems to be faltering as we approach the flag leaf period. In other words, the disease doesn't seem to be moving up to the same extent as it has in these last 3 years. And that's important because that may well affect the products that you use or the rates that you use when it comes to that all-important flag spray. And whilst it's to say that you aren't going to omit that flag leaf spray, it's a really important thing now to be monitoring just what disease you have got in your crops, because looking at this untreated 0005 here, even in 2022 we were struggling to get fungicide responses, and looking at it right at the moment, there's very little disease to be targeting. So don't rule out the fact that when you look at the second spray option, the flagleaf spray, don't rule out the fact that actually you could be toning back the amount of active ingredient or looking at perhaps cheaper products than you were initially thinking. So if you take the leaves currently from some of these more resistant varieties that are coming through, one of the things that really stands out when you compare them to the stockade in this hand is just look at how those lower leaves are effectively free from triticide and almost just senescing as a result of old age, as opposed to senescing as a result of disease. So one of the things to be really conscious of, particularly with these more resistant varieties coming through, is whether you have got levels of disease that warrant spraying. And this is particularly important when you run into one of these drier spells where the weather itself is reducing the prevalence of essentially a wet weather disease. So reminding you again, 4818 and AGT 005, just showing the lack of lesions in comparison to the stockade. So you could say at this stage it's good news. We've got varieties, admittedly mainly red feed wheats, that are coming through that have got good Septoria triticide blotch resistance. And over this last 3 years with the GRDC funded project Hyper Yielding Crops, we've seen that those varieties have really not only got very good resistance to Septoria triticide blotch, but they've got high yield potential. So varieties such as Annapurna, which was one of the first we identified, Big Red, and then more lately RGT Cesario. And at this stage you'd say, well, we've got Septoria resistance, we've actually got a drying climate, which means that Septoria hopefully won't be as big an issue for us, but we've run into another issue. And that is that last year, as many of you will be aware, stripe rust severity in certain parts of the country, particularly the southeast and the eastern states, badly affected with stripe rust. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is some of those varieties that we'd identified as having very good Septoria triticide blotch resistance don't unfortunately have that same kind of resistance to these new pathotypes, like pathotype 239 is what we've most found. And here we can see the consequences of it in a variety that we were very optimistic about in terms of its Septoria resistance, stand-in power and yield. And this is RGT Cesario. And when you look at the crop, whilst the Septoria resistance is still there, unfortunately a lot of the lower leaves are completely flecked in this foci with stripe rust. Now, stripe rust, in fairness, isn't the most difficult disease to actually combat, but when you get these very susceptible varieties, and Cesario seems the most susceptible of those newer red wheats that we'd identified with good Septoria resistance, it does actually present a worry. And many growers will have combated that this last autumn by treating with flutriafol. There's no flutriafol here. This is an untreated plot, but it does show that some of the new germplasm that we had such high hopes for in terms of general disease resistance has actually perhaps now got to be reviewed in the context of stripe rust. And stripe rust right now in this sort of drier period between the first and the second fungicide in the high rainfall zone is the primary target that we're looking to control. And we'll move on to what that means in terms of product choice where one's faced with this kind of destruction.
Yep.
So as I've said, it's RGT Cesario that probably worries us most in terms of the stripe rust susceptibility. And we've got a great example here. This is an untreated plot and this is a treated plot. And you can instantly see how our treatment has actually reserved far more green leaf than what we were showing you in that previous shot. Nonetheless, and you'd say, well, it's because you've got an untreated crop right by, and that does have an influence. But I think it's really important to understand that even with flutriafol, when that flutriafol wears off, it's really important to be thinking of combating this disease, because we are seeing that this variety, whilst giving us great resistance to septoria, isn't holding up against this 239 pathotype. So it really does need to be monitored even where you've applied flutriafol back in the autumn.
Well, we're back in the studio now, and I'd like to welcome Nick to what is the FARS Pharmacy, FARS Farmers Pharmacy podcast studios, aka your office. So yeah, welcome to your first time in the studio. We've just been out in the field together, having a look at some of the trials we've got going on as part of hyper yielding crops. So at the moment, we're at the start of spring. Spring has sprung. Certainly over the weekend, we noticed that. We have had a couple of dry months currently, with August in particular being well below the long-term average for rainfall. Our winters are sort of coming up. Well, we've just had their growth stage 31 fungicide spray, and now our springs, which were sown earlier, so end of April, they're coming up to their flag leaf spray. What should we be thinking about coming up to that sort of first spray timing, and what sort of things were we seeing out in the paddock?
Well, firstly, thanks, Darcy, for inviting me to the studio.
Right.
It's great to be here on pharmacy. I think the most important thing that growers and advisors I know will be tracking anyway, but it's particularly important just tracking the weather conditions since the first fungicide's been applied. We were only saying earlier how much lower August rainfall was. Many spring wheats that were very early sown may well have been sprayed in early August and have had little rainfall since. So understanding how much rainfall we've had since the first spray was applied, and this will be then important for the winter wheats that might have only just received their first sprays, trying to get an idea as to what kind of conditions we've experienced, and literally, we know septoria has historically been one of our bigger disease issues, but right now we've got this new fungicide working in our favour called dry weather. So let's monitor. We're needing those sort of 5 to 10 mil hits of rain in that period since the first spray to really get septoria going, and in a lot of cases we haven't had it.
Yeah, I suppose it is a point of difference compared to the last two seasons where we've had quite wet winters and springs, or even 2020 where we enjoyed, I guess, in the high rainfall zone, you can say you enjoyed a drier winter.
Yeah.
But that was followed up by a wet spring, so it was conducive for disease in the end. But this year, yeah, reasonably dry conditions, and a lot of the models are pointing to it, saying that it will stay dry. So certainly changed some of the thinking that we have in terms of disease control this year.
Absolutely.
So in terms of active ingredients, what do we have at our disposal to control our diseases?
Well, I think one of the things at the moment is, although septoria has taken a backward step, stripe rust is front and centre in a number of varieties. And here in the high rainfall zone, where we have A good proportion of our wheat is winter wheats. We've been surprised at how aggressive stripe rust has been. We believe with most of the sampling so far in Tasmania, Victoria, that it's the 239 pathotype, which is different to when we started hyper yielding crops 3 years ago. It was all the 198 pathotype. But right now it's stripe rust that's really focusing our mind in some varieties, in particular Cesario. In those cases, one of the things we've seen over these last 2-3 seasons is that epoxyconazole, Opus, Soprano, giving it some of its product names, is a very strong active and remains a strong active against stripe rust. A lot of people are combining that with azoxystrobin, the strobilurin, in the likes of Radial, Taser Expert. Those kind of combinations are still, we've seen in our trials, given us really good control of stripe rust.
So Nick, you mentioned the epoxy and the azoxy being quite good on our stripe rust, but say you can't get access to those products, they're not available. Are there any others that we can look at, even if they're not quite as good or worth thinking about?
Yeah, really good question, because I mean supply of fungicides, particularly if disease pressure is high, supply can be a big issue. And I think one of the things out of this last season that we've seen is that products like Alatus Ace, which is an SDHI combined with an older DMI, that combination in Alatus Ace is very strong and gives good residual protection against stripe rust. And so that would be another product that I think stands up well against stripe rust.
Yeah, okay. And without sort of ruining any chances of us getting sponsorships on the podcast or anything like that, are there any products that aren't quite as effective for stripe rust? Maybe just mention active ingredients rather than actual products. But
yeah, well, it's a good question, and it's really timely because this year we have 3 new mildewicides that we've got permits for, courtesy of the APVMA and the industry in South Australia, that's really pushed for growers to have access to these new mildewicides. And I think one of the things there that it's important for growers and advisors to remember is those new mildewicides, they're very good protectants against powdery mildew in wheat, but they will need to be mixed with other products such as epoxyconazole if you've got both powdery and stripe rust. And so it's important to recognise that those mildewicides are very specific compared to the fungicides that growers and advisors might normally be using.
Yep. Oh, well, that's, very handy to know. And I don't think you've damaged our chances of getting sponsorship by anyone out there in the industry. So I know we're seeing it a lot out at the site, and it's pretty much most of what we've talked about, stripe rust, but we haven't talked too much about Septoria triticide blotch, which I guess historically in the high rainfall zone is normally the poster boy for diseases. I don't know, do we still worry about it when there's so much stripe rust out?
Well, certainly last year we saw competition between those two diseases for leaf area effectively, and I think at the end of the day stripe rust usually wins because it's got that sort of shorter latent period than Septoria triticide. So by the time the triticide gets into top gear, the stripe rust has already destroyed much of that leaf area. But I think that competition we saw last year was under circumstances where we had good stripe rust conditions, but excellent conditions for Septoria triticide. Lots of wet weather as those more important money leaves, as we describe them, were coming out. This year we've got stripe rust in some varieties, as I've said, but the Septoria is being held back by another very good fungicide that we don't pay for, Darcy, that's, as you know, dry weather. So I think this year it's, all diseases will be pegged back, but at the moment it's the Septoria triticide blotch, being that wet weather disease, that's being held back more.
Yeah. So one to watch the weather forecast then.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep monitoring, because this may well run on and have an effect on whether or not we apply higher rates at Flagleaf, whether we employ cheaper products at Flagleaf. I think it'd be rare to suggest we won't do anything at Flagleaf in the high rainfall zone, but we might for sure spend less. And of course, we've got used in these last 3 years of always applying a T3 head wash, ear wash, Flagleaf top up, whatever you want to call it. And this year, that may well be something that we review seriously as to whether we do it, if it carries on being as dry as it has been through August.
So that brings us to the end of our September wheat disease update. If you'd like to see more of our stuff, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also catch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also check out the first of our cropping strategy documents, Ingrained, where we've covered wheat disease management, and that was released in early August. And you can grab a copy of that off our website. Until next time, cheers.